The dark shadow of the room slid across the wall as Mohammed looked up. The faint smell of incense filled the air, and his father's eyes, filled with fury, met his. At that moment, the air tightened, and a strange voice spoke in Mohammed's head. "You can't believe this." Mohammed, 16 years old, lived in an old house on the outskirts of Damascus. His life from childhood was steeped in fear and religious duty. His family adhered to strict Islamic traditions where every step was predetermined, and every choice was constrained by rules. As the eldest son, his destiny was already set to be an example for his younger siblings to uphold family values and follow the path his father had laid out for him. Yet, despite the respect and love he held for his family, Muhammad felt the slow, suffocating emptiness inside his heart. There was no room for doubts, questions, or search for deeper meaning in his life. The structure and certainty of his world, which he had once accepted without thought, now felt like chains. Every day was the same, a monotonous routine of prayer, study, and dutifully following the traditions of his ancestors. He had learned to pray before he could walk, and every decision, no matter how small, was made in the shadow of religious duty. His father was a strict man, a devout Muslim who saw no value in questioning the principles that had been passed down for generations. Muhammad had always tried to be the son his father wanted him to be, adhering to the customs. Without hesitation, he was expected to one day take on the same responsibilities, uphold the family's honor, and live a life according to the rigid expectations of their faith. Yet, in the stillness of the night, when the house was quiet, Muhammad began to feel something stir inside him. It was a feeling that had been growing for some time but had remained unspoken. He had begun to question the life he was living, the constant demands, the endless rituals, the expectations that weighed down on him like a heavy cloak. He wanted to understand the purpose of it all, to know why he was following this path, and whether there was something more to life than the rules that governed it. The sense of purpose that had once felt so clear to him now seemed distant, like an illusion. One evening, as his family slept soundly, Muhammad lay awake in his room, staring up at the ceiling. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. For the first time, he allowed himself to question everything. The life his family had built around him, the teachings he had been raised on, the strictness of his father's words. What was it all for? Was this really the truth? Or was there more to life? Something he had been kept from seeing. A deep sense of yearning began to fill the void inside him, the longing for answers that went beyond the boundaries of what he had been taught. His mind raced with questions that he had never dared ask before. Was this the life he was meant to live? Was there something else beyond the prayers, the rituals, the endless repetitions of the same beliefs? What did it mean to truly live? What was the purpose of suffering, of fear, of obedience if there was no greater meaning to it all? In the quiet of that night, Muhammad made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He decided to seek answers outside the narrow confines of the life he had known. He began to read, in secret, books and articles that challenged everything he had been taught. At first, it felt wrong, like he was betraying his family, his faith. But he couldn't stop himself. He had to know. He had to find the truth, no matter the cost. One day, while browsing through a collection of books he had hidden in a corner of his room, Muhammad stumbled upon something that would stir his soul in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was a story about Christianity, about the teachings of love, forgiveness, and the life of Jesus Christ. The words seemed to speak directly to him, filling the empty spaces in his heart with a warmth he had never known. The idea of a faith that centered on love, a love that was unconditional and all-encompassing, resonated deeply with him. It was a stark contrast to the strict, rule-bound faith he had grown up with, but there was something compelling about it, something that made him feel, for the first time, that he was not alone in his search for meaning. As he read more about the life of Jesus, Muhammad's heart began to open to new possibilities. The idea of grace, forgiveness, and a personal relationship with God was foreign to him. Yet it was a truth that felt more real than anything he had ever been taught. For the first time, he understood the concept of God's love not as an abstract principle or a distant command, but as something tangible, something that could be felt and experienced. It was a revelation that shook him to his core. But as the days passed, Muhammad felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The fear of discovery loomed large. What if his family found out? What if his father learned of his doubts, of the books he was reading, of the faith he was beginning to embrace in secret? The consequences of such a revelation were unthinkable in his world. To question Islam was not just a sin, it was an act of betrayal. The very idea of leaving the faith was so forbidden, so dangerous, that it could cost him everything: his family, his freedom, even his life. Yet despite the fear that gripped him, Muhammad couldn't shake the growing conviction in his heart. The more he learned, the more he understood that this was the truth he had been searching for. And for the first time, he felt alive in a way he had never known before. The teachings of Jesus brought him a sense of peace that had been absent from his life for as long as he could remember. They gave him the courage to keep searching, to keep questioning, even if it meant walking a dangerous path. As the weeks passed, Muhammad's secret journey deepened. He began to spend more time in prayer, but it was different now. It wasn't the formal prayers he had been taught as a child. It was a prayer from the heart, a plea for understanding, for guidance, for truth. He prayed for strength to continue on this new path, even though he knew it would lead him into conflict with everything he had ever known. One night, while he sat in his room, staring at the pages of a Bible he had managed to acquire, Muhammad felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was as if he had found the missing piece of the puzzle that had haunted him for so long. For the first time in his life, he felt connected to something greater than himself, something that transcended the rules and the rituals he had been raised to follow. But as he sat there, his heart heavy with the weight of his new understanding, he knew that the moment of truth was approaching. He could no longer keep his faith a secret. He had to share it, to tell someone what he had found. But deep down, he knew that once he did, there would be no going back. His family, his life, as he knew it, would be shattered. And yet, despite the fear that gnawed at him, Muhammad knew that the truth was worth any price. In the quiet darkness of his room, he closed the Bible and whispered a prayer, asking God for the courage to face whatever lay ahead. His journey had only just begun, but he knew that the path he was on would lead him to a place of truth and freedom he had never known before. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he was no longer afraid to walk it. Each passing day, Muhammad felt his inner turmoil growing increasingly unbearable. The fear, the love for his family, and the growing sense of spiritual emptiness created a deep conflict within him. He had tried to pray the way he had been taught, but it no longer brought him comfort. The familiar rituals felt hollow, their words just an empty echo in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes to pray, his heart felt more distant from the God he had always known. It was as though something essential was missing, something that could never be filled by the prayers he had memorized since childhood. In the quiet of his room, the walls surrounding him felt suffocating. The books he had secretly been reading, the stories of Christianity and the teachings of Jesus, now seemed to call to him more urgently than ever. They resonated deeply, offering the peace he longed for, a peace he had never experienced before. Yet, with every page he turned, every verse he read, the weight of his decision pressed harder upon him. His world had always been so small, defined by rules and expectations, and now it felt as though everything he knew was shattering. He had learned of a love that was unconditional, a forgiveness that went beyond anything he had been taught, of a God who was not distant and demanding, but near and compassionate. The more he read, the more he understood that Jesus was not just a prophet to be respected, but a savior to be embraced. Muhammad's heart ached as he read about the love and grace that had been offered to sinners, the promise of a new life, a life without the burden of fear and ritual. It was a love that filled him with a sense of belonging, something he had never known despite being part of a family that upheld the highest traditions. The internal struggle became more intense with each passing day. Every time he tried to pray the Islamic prayers, his heart felt torn. He loved his family deeply, but he could no longer ignore the truth that had awakened in him. He had to make a choice. The path he had been walking no longer felt like his own. It felt imposed upon him, an expectation he could never truly live up to. He was expected to follow in the footsteps of his father, to carry on the family legacy, to be the model of piety and obedience. But what was the point of obedience when it did not resonate with his soul? What was the point of praying to a God who felt distant, when he could sense a new truth that brought him closer to peace? One evening, after reading yet another passage from the New Testament, Muhammad finally reached a breaking point. It was as though a veil had been lifted from his eyes, and he could see beyond the confines of his upbringing. The teachings of Jesus' love, his sacrifice, his invitation to a new life were no longer just stories. They were the truth Muhammad had been searching for. His heart swelled with a sense of purpose, a purpose that was not defined by his father's expectations, but by the call of something greater, something that had always been within him, waiting to be recognized. The decision came as a quiet yet resolute moment in the stillness of his room. Muhammad knew what he had to do. It was the only way forward. He could no longer live a lie, no longer pretend to be something he was not. He had to accept Jesus Christ into his heart, regardless of the cost. He knew that doing so would sever the ties to everything he had known: his family, his community, his entire life. but he also knew that it was the only way to truly live. That night, in the quiet darkness of his room, Muhammad knelt on the floor. The weight of his decision was heavy, but the peace that settled over him as he prayed was unlike anything he had ever felt. He spoke to Jesus as though he were standing right beside him, pouring out his heart, confessing his belief and making a vow to follow him, no matter where the road would lead. It was a silent promise, a secret pledge he made in the solitude of his room, where no one could see, where no one could judge. As he finished his prayer, Muhammad felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over him. For the first time in his life, he felt free. The heavy burden of doubt and confusion had been lifted, replaced by a profound sense of certainty. He knew that his decision was dangerous, that it could lead to unimaginable consequences. But at that moment, none of that mattered. He had made his choice, and in doing so, he had found peace. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of inner conflict. Muhammad could not speak to anyone about his new faith. His family would never understand. He had grown up in a world where even the slightest deviation from tradition was seen as a betrayal. He feared that if anyone found out, it would not only destroy his relationship with his family, but would also put his life in jeopardy. In his country, to leave Islam was a crime punishable by death. The thought of his family's reaction, the shame they would feel, made his heart heavy with guilt. Yet, despite this, Muhammad knew that he had made the right choice. There was no turning back now. In the quiet of his room, Muhammad began to pray differently. No longer did he recite the familiar verses from the Quran by rote. Instead, he prayed with his heart, speaking to Jesus as though he were right there with him. His prayers were simple but sincere. He didn't know all the right words, didn't know how to properly pray as a Christian, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was speaking to God from the deepest part of his soul. He also began to study the Bible more fervently, savoring every word, every story. He felt as though a new world had opened up to him, a world full of hope, love, and redemption. For the first time, Muhammad felt that he truly understood what it meant to have a relationship with God, not through rules and rituals, but through love and grace. The teachings of Jesus were not just a set of commands to be followed. They were an invitation to a new way of life, a life marked by forgiveness, compassion, and transformation. But with each passing day, the weight of his secret grew heavier. Muhammad knew that he couldn't keep this from his family forever. His father, especially, would never accept it. He was a man of great pride, a devout Muslim who had lived his entire life according to the strictest interpretations of Islam. Muhammad had been raised to honor his father above all else, to obey him without question. The thought of betraying his father, of breaking his heart, was almost too much to bear. Yet as the days turned into weeks, Muhammad's resolve only strengthened. He knew that sooner or later, he would have to confront the truth. He could no longer live a life of secrecy, pretending to be someone he was not. But when the time came to confess, he knew that it would change everything. He would have to face the consequences of his decision, no matter how painful they might be. And deep down, he feared that the consequences might be more than he could bear. That night, as Muhammad sat alone in his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was on the verge of a great transformation. The decision he had made, the path he had chosen, would lead him down a road that was both dangerous and filled with hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He could never go back to the life he had left behind. He had taken a step into the unknown, a step of faith that would change everything. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Muhammad felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, he felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Several weeks had passed, and life in Muhammad's family remained unchanged. The routines were the same, the prayers, the meals, the strict adherence to tradition, all continuing in their predictable cycle. Yet Muhammad could no longer hide his inner turmoil. The peace he once tried to find in his prayers had become elusive, slipping further away each time he knelt to recite the words of his faith. There were days when the weight of the rituals felt unbearable, and the more he tried to submit, the more he felt disconnected. The warm, comforting embrace of his childhood faith had turned cold, and he could feel the cracks deep within him, widening with every passing day. Every time his father, or his younger brother, Sami, reminded him of the importance of following the Islamic faith, a sharp pang of resistance shot through his heart. They spoke with unwavering certainty, as though the path was clear and indisputable. But to Muhammad, the words felt like chains. He could no longer pretend that he did not feel the pull of something else, something beyond the strictures of his family's beliefs. He had tried to push the thoughts aside, to bury them under a blanket of routine. But each time he tried to pray or attend the mosque, it became harder to ignore the deep dissatisfaction gnawing at him. He no longer fit into the mold that had been carefully crafted for him by his family. He felt as though he was suffocating under the weight of expectations that no longer made sense to him. In those moments, the house, with its heavy stone walls and the constant murmur of prayer in the background, felt more like a prison than a home. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the sound of Quranic verses recited in unison, and the oppressive weight of tradition. Muhammad's heart longed for something different, but every time he tried to explore that longing, it only led him further into conflict. His mind was torn between the love he felt for his family and the undeniable truth he had encountered. He couldn't erase the images of the loving forgiveness he had read about in the New Testament, nor could he forget the peace he felt when he prayed to Jesus. Every time he tried to pray in the traditional way, the words felt hollow, empty of the meaning they once held. The tension began to manifest in small ways. His temper, once calm and measured, began to flare more easily. The simplest comments from his father or siblings about the importance of following the correct path sent waves of anger through him. His father, always so proud of his son's adherence to the family's beliefs, had begun to speak more frequently about the importance of following the rules, of living a life that would honor their ancestors and the family name. These words, meant to encourage him, now felt like a suffocating force, pressing down on him, reminding him of the life he no longer wished to live. But it wasn't just his father's words that weighed on him. It was the eyes of his younger brother, Sammy. Though the boy was still young, he had always looked up to Muhammad with adoration. Sammy saw his older brother as a role model, a reflection of everything he hoped to become. He would follow Muhammad around, trying to mimic his every move, his every word. But recently, Muhammad had begun to notice the change in Sammy's eyes. The innocent admiration had turned into quiet suspicion. Sammy, still unaware of the true reason for the shift, had begun to ask Muhammad questions that felt invasive, even if they were innocent. It all came to a head one evening when Muhammad was praying alone in his room. The faintest sound of footsteps reached his ears, followed by the soft creak of the door. He didn't need to turn around to know that Sammy was standing there watching him. He had grown used to the younger boy's curious glances, but this time, it felt different. There was a quiet intensity in the way Sammy stood, his eyes fixed on Muhammad as though trying to understand something that had shifted. Sammy was still too young to fully grasp what was happening, but he wasn't blind. He had begun to notice the changes in his brother. Muhammad no longer recited his prayers with the same fervor, nor did he spend as much time in the mosque. Sammy had also overheard conversations between their parents, who had begun to question why Muhammad was no longer as committed to the family's religious practices. Sammy, despite his youth, was perceptive enough to realize that something was wrong, even if he couldn't yet put his finger on what exactly it was. That evening, Sammy approached Muhammad cautiously, standing just inside the door. Muhammad felt his presence before he even heard the footsteps, a shiver running down his spine as he braced himself for what was to come. Sammy's voice, though soft, carried a weight that made Muhammad's heart race. The younger boy simply asked, "Why do you pray like that now?" The question was innocent, but it cut through Muhammad like a blade. He had hoped to keep his new faith hidden, to continue living his life as he had always done, with just enough secrecy to avoid confrontation. But now, standing before him, was his brother, his innocent eyes searching for answers that Muhammad wasn't ready to give. Muhammad's mind raced. How could he explain something so profound to Sammy when he himself had only just come to terms with it? How could he put into words the truth he had found in secret, a truth that would tear their family apart if it was ever discovered? The weight of his choice, the weight of his faith, pressed down on him with unbearable force. He needed to protect Sammy, to shield him from the same pain he feared would come to him. But the truth burned within him. It was too late to turn back now. Muhammad could no longer pretend to be someone he was not. In the end, he simply told Sammy that he needed more time, that things were changing, and that he was trying to find his way. He didn't know what else to say. His words were soft, almost too soft, and they seemed to pass over Sammy without truly answering his question. But Muhammad could see the doubt creeping into his younger brother's eyes. Sammy didn't understand, but he would remember this moment, this fleeting interaction, and the quiet unease that it left in the air. The silence between the brothers hung heavily in the room, but neither spoke of it again. Muhammad's decision, the quiet rebellion in his heart, had been exposed, even if only in part. Sammy's suspicions would not fade, and soon, his parents would begin to notice the growing distance between their sons. The tension in Muhammad's chest tightened. He knew that the time to keep his secret was running out. As the days passed, Muhammad found it harder to keep up the facade of normalcy. Every interaction with his family felt like a performance, a delicate balance between the life he had always known and the life he was quietly building in secret. His father continued to offer words of encouragement, reminding Muhammad of his duty. But they fell on deaf ears. The more his father spoke, the further Muhammad fell from him. The more his family tried to pull him back into the fold, the stronger his resolve became. It was clear that the cracks in his once perfect life were beginning to show. And soon, the shadows that had hidden his faith would no longer be enough to keep him safe. He could feel it in the air, a storm brewing on the horizon. Days passed since Muhammad's inner turmoil had begun to bleed into his outward actions. The weight of his secret, the new faith he had embraced, became an unbearable burden, one that he could no longer carry in silence. It felt as though every moment he spent hiding the truth was another moment that chipped away at his integrity. He knew it was time to confront the reality of his choices, time to break the silence that had held him in fear for so long. There was no more pretending, no more quiet defiance. The truth had to come out. His family had to know, even if it meant losing them forever. He had considered the possibility of telling his father first, but the thought of facing his father's wrath, of seeing the disappointment in his eyes, was more than he could bear. Instead, he chose to confide in his older brother, Ahmed. Ahmed was the figurehead of the family, the protector, the one who had always shouldered the responsibility of maintaining the family's honor. He had always looked out for Muhammad, offering guidance and care, despite their age difference. Muhammad's decision to approach Ahmed was not out of fear, but a strange desire to seek understanding from the one person who might still hold some sway over him. The day Muhammad decided to tell his brother, he could not escape the overwhelming sense of dread that settled deep within his chest. His hands trembled, his thoughts swirled in a chaotic frenzy. He knew that once the words left his lips, there would be no turning back. The path would be set, and the consequences would follow. He found Ahmed alone in the family room, the air thick with the scent of burning incense and the muted hum of distant conversations from other rooms. It was an intimate space, quiet, almost serene and stark, contrast to the storm raging inside Muhammad. The sight of his brother, sitting there with his book in hand, filled Muhammad with both a sense of connection and an undeniable fear. He had rehearsed the words in his mind countless times, but now, as he stood at the threshold of his confession, they felt foreign. The silence between them grew heavier, thick with the unsaid. Finally, Muhammad spoke, his voice soft but steady. Ahmed, I've chosen a different path. I've become a Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ now. The words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Ahmed's reaction was immediate. His expression, once calm and collected, turned to shock. His eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, he simply stared at Muhammad as if trying to understand the gravity of the words he had just heard. The room seemed to close in around them, and Muhammad could feel the weight of his brother's gaze, the silence echoing in his ears. Ahmed stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. The calmness that had once defined him evaporated, replaced by a quiet fury that simmered just beneath the surface. His face flushed with a mix of confusion and anger, and his voice trembled as he tried to process the words. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Muhammad's with a look that was both accusatory and sorrowful. Muhammad could see the storm brewing in his brother's heart, a storm that mirrored his own internal chaos. Why? Ahmed's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of tradition, family honor, and loyalty. How could you abandon everything? How could you turn your back on our faith, on our family? This is not the path of your ancestors. You're my brother, my blood. How can you throw all of that away? The words stung, but they were nothing compared to the depth of the pain Muhammad felt. He had known this would come. He had known that Ahmed, with his devotion to the family's traditions and his unwavering faith, would never understand. But hearing it, seeing the hurt and disbelief in his brother's eyes, was almost too much to bear. Muhammad had spent countless nights wrestling with his decision, with the overwhelming pull of a faith that felt like a beacon of light in a world that had always seemed so dark. But now, in the face of Ahmed's anger, that light seemed distant, fragile, and uncertain. I didn't choose this lightly, Muhammad responded, his voice shaking. I've never felt more alive, more at peace than I do now. I had to follow what my heart was telling me, no matter the cost. I couldn't keep living a lie, pretending to be someone I'm not. I'm sorry, Ahmed, but this is who I am now. Ahmed's face twisted in disbelief. His mind raced to comprehend what Muhammad was saying, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not understand how his brother, the person he had always looked up to, could reject everything they had been taught. His heart ached with the thought that Muhammad had chosen a path that, in his eyes, led only to destruction. For Ahmed, the faith they had been raised in was the very foundation of their lives. It was the unshakable truth that defined their existence. And to see his brother abandoned, it was as if the ground beneath his feet had crumbled. "Do you know what you're doing?" Ahmed's voice grew louder, the anger beginning to seep into his words. "This is treason. It's apostasy. Understand the consequences. You've just condemned yourself. This is the end of you. Think our family will accept this? You'll be cast out. You'll lose everything: our name, our honor, our legacy. All of it will be gone." Muhammad felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by the fierce resolve that had taken root in his heart. He had already given up so much: his old life, his old beliefs, his old self. The loss of his family, the potential alienation that awaited him, no longer seemed as important as the peace he had found in Jesus Christ. He knew the consequences would be dire, but he could no longer ignore the truth that had set him free. "I know," Muhammad whispered, his voice breaking, "but I've already lost so much by not following what I believe in. I can't keep pretending. I'm sorry, Ahmed. I can't go back." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Ahmed stood frozen, his face pale with a mixture of disbelief and horror. His brother, the one person he had trusted, the one person he had always believed would carry on their family's legacy, had chosen a different path. It was as though the foundation of everything he had known had been shattered in a single moment. For a long while, neither spoke. The tension in the room was unbearable. Each man lost in his own thoughts, grappling with the enormity of the situation. Muhammad could feel his brother's gaze boring into him, searching for a way to bring him back, to make him see reason. But Muhammad knew that there was no turning back now. His decision had been made, and the truth of his faith could no longer be hidden. When the silence was finally broken, it was by Ahmed's words, harsh and cold. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice low and distant. "But know this, you will never be welcome here again. You are no longer a part of this family. You've betrayed us. You've betrayed your own blood." Muhammad's heart sank, but the words did not break him. He had already prepared himself for the consequences, the betrayal, the rejection, the anger. It was all part of the cost. But despite the sting of his brother's words, a part of him felt a strange peace. He had made his choice, and he knew he would never be the same again. The life he had known was over, but a new life awaited him, one built on a foundation of faith, love, and truth. As Ahmed turned and walked away, Muhammad stood still, his chest heavy with the weight of the moment. He had crossed a line, one that could never be undone. The door to his old life had closed, and in its place, an uncertain future awaited. But for the first time in a long time, Muhammad felt like he was walking in the light, and that was all that mattered. The consequences would come, but he would face them with a heart full of hope. The evening had settled into a heavy silence as the family gathered in the modest living room of their home. The air was thick with the scent of cooking and the quiet murmur of voices, but something felt off. Muhammad, once the embodiment of obedience and respect, now sat with an unspoken tension hanging around him. His father, who had always prided himself on being able to read his children's emotions, noticed the subtle shift in his eldest son. Muhammad's eyes were distant, not the eyes of a son who adhered to the family's traditions and expectations. There was something hidden in his gaze, something his father could not immediately place, but felt in the pit of his stomach. The family sat around the table, the usual light-hearted chatter subdued, as each member went about their own business. But all the while, the father's attention never left Muhammad. His silence, the absent look in his eyes, were unusual. Muhammad had always been the dutiful son, the one who followed the rules and never strayed from the path laid out for him. The father had no reason to suspect anything was amiss until now. Slowly, the weight of his suspicions grew heavier with each passing second. Each moment that Muhammad refused to meet his eyes, his son's strange behavior had not gone unnoticed by his father, and soon, the moment of reckoning was inevitable. Finally, the father could not suppress his concern any longer. He had to know. His voice, once warm and calm, now held a sharp edge, heavy with the weight of his growing fear. He started asking Muhammad questions, trying to dig beneath the surface, but Muhammad remained silent, unwilling to meet his father's gaze. The questions continued to rise, one after another, pressing against Muhammad's resolve, until he could no longer hold the truth inside. He knew it was time to face the consequences of his decision, no matter how much it cost him. His throat tightened as the words left his lips. "I'm no longer a Muslim. I've become a Christian." The room fell into a stunned silence. His father's face twisted, as though he had been struck. The shock in his eyes was immediate, like he could not believe what he had just heard. His son, his eldest, the one who was meant to uphold the family's honor, had not only turned his back on their faith, but had embraced a foreign belief. The air in the room felt as though it had thickened, each breath heavier than the last. It was as if the weight of this admission hung in the very air around them, suffocating all who were present. His father's disbelief turned into something darker, something far more dangerous. For years, the father had taught his children the value of their faith, the teachings, the traditions, the expectations. They were not just beliefs, they were the very foundation of their family. To turn away from Islam was to betray not just the religion, but the family, the very blood that ran through their veins. Muhammad's decision was an unforgivable offense, something so incomprehensible to his father that it was almost beyond rational thought. This was not just a matter of faith, it was a matter of honor, of legacy, of the respect they had always commanded in their community. To abandon all of that was to dishonor everything they had worked for, everything they had believed in. Muhammad's father stood up abruptly, his movements sharp and filled with a rage that was almost palpable. His eyes, once filled with love and pride, now burned with fury and hurt. He could not fathom what his son had done, and the shame he felt spread through him like wildfire. His breath became ragged as he spat accusations at Muhammad, his words sharp, cutting into the silence that had enveloped the room. He spoke of betrayal, of disgrace, of the irreversible damage that Muhammad's actions had caused to the family's reputation. But Muhammad stood still, his body rigid, though his heart was heavy with the weight of his decision. Despite the verbal onslaught, he could not bring himself to regret his choice. He had known the consequences, had known that this moment would come, and yet, now that it had arrived, he found that his spirit was calm. A sense of peace had settled deep within him, even as the storm raged around him. He had made his choice, and though he could see the devastation it caused, he could not take it back. But the father's anger did not subside. It grew, fed by a sense of betrayal that ran deeper than words could express. His mind spun with thoughts of what this would mean for their family, for their future. He had worked his entire life to maintain the family's honor, to ensure that his children followed the path of righteousness. And now, his son had shattered that illusion with a single confession. The father's fury reached a boiling point. He turned away from Muhammad, and for a brief moment, the room was filled only with the sounds of his heavy breathing, the deep, guttural breaths that seemed to shake the very walls. In that moment, Ahmed, the older brother, who had been watching the scene unfold in silence, could no longer contain himself. The weight of the family's anger, the crushing disappointment, was too much for him to bear. His emotions spiraled out of control, and in a split second, he reached for the gun that he always kept nearby. His hand was shaking, his breath short, and in a haze of rage and confusion, he pointed the gun at Muhammad. The shot rang out, loud and deafening. Muhammad's body jerked violently as the bullet struck his leg. Pain exploded through him, the sensation so sharp and intense that it seemed to numb everything else in his world. His vision blurred, and he collapsed to the ground, his hands instinctively clutching his leg as the blood began to pool beneath him. The family's screams echoed in his ears, but he could not respond. The pain was overwhelming, but even as he lay there, his body trembling, his heart remained eerily calm. It was as though the world around him had slowed to a crawl, and in that moment, the only thing he could feel was a profound sense of peace. Despite the searing pain, Muhammad did not cry out. His mind, although clouded with pain, clung to the peace that had settled within him ever since he had embraced his new faith. He could hear his father's voice, shouting in anger, but it felt distant, as though it were coming from far away. The world seemed to spin around him as he lay there, the blood from his wound spreading across the floor like an irreversible stain. But his spirit remained untouched, serene, and unwavering. His father's rage continued, but Muhammad did not respond. His body, broken and bleeding, was a testament to the family's wrath, but in his heart, he knew that the price of his choice was worth it. His family, his blood, might never forgive him, but the peace he had found in his faith and the love of Jesus was something that could never be taken away. As the chaos unfolded around him, Muhammad's mind wandered back to the quiet moments of prayer, to the gentle whispers of faith that had led him to this point. The physical pain was sharp, but it did not compare to the spiritual weight that had once burdened his soul. Now, lying there on the cold floor, Muhammad understood that his journey had just begun, and that this was the moment that would define his life forever. After the gunshot, everything became a blur of pain and confusion. Muhammad found himself in the sterile, bright light of a hospital room, his leg wrapped in bandages, the dull, constant throb of his wound serving as a harsh reminder of the chaos he had just experienced. Yet, amidst the physical pain, there was something else, something deeper, that filled him, a sense of peace, a deep, undeniable freedom that transcended the hurt. He had been lying in this sterile bed, his family's wrath having torn through him both physically and emotionally, yet something within him remained untouched. He was alive, and despite the pain and suffering that came with the bullet that had pierced his body, he felt the overwhelming weight of his decision lifting off his shoulders. His father's rage, his brother's betrayal, and the family's shame no longer had any hold over him. He had made a choice, an irreversible one, and now there was no going back. The old world he had known, the world of expectations, obligations, and suffocating traditions, no longer mattered. The bullet, as painful as it had been, had freed him in ways he had never expected. His faith in Jesus had brought him to this moment of clarity. He was no longer bound to his family's legacy or their version of the truth. The path he had chosen was one of freedom, and no amount of violence or fear could take that away from him. As he lay in the hospital bed, his thoughts wandered back to the moments leading up to the confession, to the quiet peace he had felt the first time he had prayed to Jesus, to the strength he had found in his own heart when he had declared his faith. It was in that moment of quiet surrender that he had understood. He was no longer a prisoner of his family's expectations, nor of the rigid religious confines that had held him captive for so long. He had chosen to live in the truth, and that truth would carry him forward, no matter where it led. His recovery in the hospital was slow and painful. Each day, the physical wound was tended to, cleaned, and dressed, but it was the spiritual healing that took precedence in Muhammad's heart. He knew he could never go back to the life he had known, to the home where he had been raised, whereas every move had been scrutinized, every decision made for him by others. The pain in his leg was nothing compared to the spiritual and emotional freedom that he now held within. Every morning as he awoke, he felt a sense of purpose that had never been there before. It was as if the weight of his entire existence had been lifted, replaced by something much lighter, something that made him feel alive in a way he had never felt before. Muhammad understood that the time had come to leave. He could not remain in the house that had once been his sanctuary and his prison. His family, who once had been everything to him, now represented the chains that had bound him for so long. His decision to follow Jesus had set him on a path from which there was no return. The love, the fear, the anger of his family had no power over him anymore. The choice was made. His faith had given him the courage to face a future where he no longer had to hide, no longer had to pretend, no longer had to live in fear of retribution. But this new path was not without its dangers. His family would search for him. The country in which he had been born and raised would never accept his beliefs. He would be hunted like an animal, forced into hiding, constantly looking over his shoulder, living in fear of being found. But Muhammad knew this would be the price of his freedom. His faith in Jesus had made him stronger than any fear, braver than any consequence. The chains that had once held him in the dark were now broken, and he could move freely. Though the cost was high, his decision to leave Syria and seek asylum in another country was not easy. It took months of planning, of living in constant fear, of being discovered, of evading the eyes of the authorities and his own family. But each step he took away from the house where he had been raised felt like a step towards something greater. He no longer feared the dark, for he had found light. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and hardship, but it was a journey he had chosen freely, a journey that could not be taken from him. In the dead of night, he packed his few belongings, a small bag of clothes, a Bible, and a prayer journal he had kept hidden for months. He had to leave behind everything: his family, his home, the life he had known, but he could not carry the weight of that old world with him anymore. The weight of his new identity, however, was light, almost weightless, for he had chosen to live in the truth. It was the only way he could move forward. The first step outside his home felt like a rebirth. The streets of Damascus, once familiar and comforting, now felt strange, foreign, even menacing. Every shadow seemed like a potential threat, every passerby a possible spy. But Muhammad moved through the streets with a calm resolve, as though he had already crossed over to the other side, as though his physical departure from the house had already separated him from his old life. He had become a stranger in his own land, a fugitive from the very people who had once loved him. Yet in his heart, there was a quiet joy, a satisfaction that came from knowing that he was finally free to be who he was meant to be. Leaving Syria was not an easy task. Crossing borders, avoiding detection, and securing passage to a new country, all of these things came with risks. But Muhammad, despite the weight of his injury and the fear that gnawed at his insides, moved forward with unwavering determination. He was not running away from his family. He was running toward a new life, a life where he could live without the chains of fear, guilt, and shame. Every step he took was a step closer to freedom. Eventually, after weeks of hiding, traveling through back roads and covert paths, he arrived in a new country, one that offered him asylum. He was greeted with a sense of safety that he had never known before. For the first time in years, he was able to breathe freely. There were no more whispers in the dark, no more threats from his family, no more fear of being discovered. He was free. His first moments in this new land were a blur of emotions: relief, fear, excitement, and sorrow all mixed together. He had left behind everything he had ever known, and yet, in that moment, he felt more at home than he had ever felt in his life. The peace that had filled his heart since his conversion to Christianity seemed to fill every inch of his new surroundings. Here, he could live openly without fear. Here, he could follow his faith without the threat of death looming over him. Here, he was no longer a fugitive, he was a man reborn, free to live as he chose. Though he had left his family behind, Muhammad knew that his journey was far from over. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was walking the path he was meant to walk, a path of freedom, faith, and hope. And as he took his first steps in this new land, he understood that this was only the beginning of a new life, a new identity, and a future that he could shape for himself.